The night Donovan Reed threw his company launch party at the top of the Meridian Tower, he made sure to send Veronica Shaw an invitation personally. Not through his assistant. Not through the company mailing list. Personally, a cream envelope slid under her apartment door with a handwritten note on the back. "Come see what you missed out on." Veronica stood in her kitchen, holding that envelope for a long time. The coffee she'd made went cold. The morning light moved across the floor, and she didn't move with it. She knew exactly what he meant. She knew because 3 years ago, Donovan had stood in her living room and told her she was the problem. That her obsession with a single client account was dragging the whole firm down. That he needed someone beside him who understood what it took to build something real, and she clearly wasn't that person anymore. He had said all of this on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had lost her job, her office, and the parking spot she'd held for 6 years. By the following Monday, she learned he had taken her client, Vantage Capital, the account she had spent 18 months cultivating from a cold call, into a $12 million contract, and restructured it under his name. By the end of that month, she found out he was engaged to Priya Menon, her former junior associate, the woman who had sat in on every single one of Veronica's strategy meetings and taken notes. She hadn't gone to pieces. That was the part people always got wrong about her. She hadn't crumbled. She had sat very still for about a week, eating cereal for dinner and watching weather reports she didn't care about, and then she had gotten up, put on her coat, and started over. But the invitation changed things, because Donovan wasn't inviting her to celebrate. He was inviting her to witness. There was a difference, and they both knew it. He wanted her in the room when he stood at that podium and announced that Reed Consulting Group had just closed a $140 million deal with Hargrove Industries. He wanted her face in the crowd when the applause started. He wanted to watch her watch him win. Veronica set the envelope on the counter and went to get dressed for work. She had started small. That was the only honest way to describe the years after Donovan fired her. She freelanced for 2 years out of a studio apartment in Midtown, taking clients that bigger firms had passed on, building things back one relationship at a time. It was slow work. It was sometimes humiliating work. There were months where she stared at spreadsheets that didn't add up and wondered if he'd been right about her. She never let herself wonder that for long. The thing about Veronica was that she had always been better at seeing what other people couldn't. That was her real skill, not the presentations, not the client dinners, not the quarterly reports. She could walk into a company that was bleeding money and find the one thing they were doing wrong that nobody had named yet. She had done it for Donovan for 7 years before she ever got credit for it. The client that changed everything was a biotech firm out of Austin called Lodestar. They came to her through a referral, half desperate, 18 months from running out of funding. Their product was sound. Their positioning was catastrophic. They were pitching themselves to the wrong investors, using language that meant nothing to the people who could actually save them. Veronica spent 4 months rebuilding their entire investor narrative from scratch. She rewrote their pitch deck 11 times. She flew to 3 cities on her own dime to make introductions she believed in. And when Lodestar closed their Series B, $42 million, from a consortium she had personally assembled, the CEO, a quietly intense man named Franklin Cross, took her to dinner and said something she didn't expect. He said, "I want to know who's managing your firm." She told him it was just her. He looked at her across the table for a moment. Then he said, "That needs to change." Franklin Cross wasn't a billionaire in the way people imagine billionaires. He didn't have a yacht or a car collection. He had 3 monitors on his desk and a coffee machine he refused to replace, even though it was broken in a specific way that only he knew how to work around. What he had, in terms that mattered, was capital, connections, and an instinct for people who could execute. He had built and sold 2 companies before Lodestar. He was building a third, and he had decided, over the course of 4 months of working with Veronica Shaw, that she was someone worth backing. They kept her independence. He provided the infrastructure, office space, a small team, introductions to his network. Shaw Strategy Group opened its doors 14 months after Donovan had handed her a box of desk belongings and watched security escort her to the elevator. It was not the kind of story that made the news right away. It was the kind that built quietly, deal by deal, until one day people started to notice. The invitation sat on her counter for 3 days before she made a decision. She called her assistant, a sharp young woman named Olivia, and asked her to look into the Meridian Tower event, the guest list, the format, the press coverage expected. Olivia called back in an hour. "It's a big room," she said. 200 guests. Business press will be there. He's announcing the Hargrove deal officially and launching the rebrand. There's a cocktail hour, then a formal dinner. Seated. Who's on the guest list? Half the financial district. A few city council members. Some of the Vantage Capital team. Veronica went quiet. The Vantage people will be there, Olivia said carefully. The ones who signed with him after you left. I know who they are. He's framing the whole thing as a 10-year overnight success story. Olivia paused. The press materials reference his founding vision about 12 times. There it was. Veronica thought about the first time she had walked into a Vantage Capital boardroom. She thought about the partners who had looked at her like she had accidentally wandered in from the wrong floor. She thought about the 18 months she had spent earning their trust, learning their language, building something she genuinely believed in. And the precise moment she had understood that Donovan had taken it. She didn't feel rage anymore when she thought about it. That had faded a long time ago. What she felt was something quieter and more clarifying, something that felt, if she was honest, a little like patience finally arriving at its destination. RSVP, yes, she said, to his party. To his party. Olivia was quiet for a beat. Should I let Franklin know? Not yet. What Donovan Reed did not know, what he could not have known, because he had stopped paying attention to Veronica Shaw the moment she stopped being useful to him, was that Hargrove Industries had a problem. It was not the kind of problem that showed up in press releases. It was the kind that lived in the gap between what a company announced and what it actually had. Hargrove was overextended. Their manufacturing arm had made 3 bad acquisitions in 18 months and was quietly hemorrhaging. The $140 million deal with Reed Consulting was real, but the consulting contract existed to help Hargrove restructure, which meant that if the restructuring failed, the contract unwound with it. Veronica knew this because one of the Hargrove board members, a cautious man named Charles Whitfield, who had sat across from her at a charity dinner 6 months ago, had mentioned, with studied casualness, that he was beginning to have concerns about the direction the company was heading. She had listened very carefully. She had asked the right questions. And afterward, she had gone back to her office and spent 2 weeks building a proposal that addressed every concern Charles Whitfield had named, and several he hadn't thought to name yet. She had not sent it anywhere. She had simply kept it ready. 2 days before Donovan's party, Charles Whitfield called her directly. He said the board was considering their options. He said they wanted a second opinion on the restructuring plan currently in place, he said. And this part he said very quietly, that some members had started asking who else might be able to step in if it came to that. Veronica told him she'd be in touch within 24 hours. She called Franklin Cross. He listened to her without interrupting, which was the thing she had come to value most about him. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" Hargrove needs a real restructuring partner, not a consulting contract. If the board is willing to move, I want to put together a formal proposal. Full operational engagement, not advisory timeline. Before the party. Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him doing something with his broken coffee machine, and then he said, "Call Charles Whitfield back tonight." The night of the party arrived cold and clear, the kind of New York night where the city looked expensive from a distance. The Meridian Tower lobby was full of people who dressed like they had somewhere important to be, which most of them did. Donovan had spared nothing. There were orchids on every surface, a jazz quartet in the corner, waitstaff moving through the crowd with champagne flutes so thin they looked like they might dissolve. Donovan stood near the entrance with Priya on his arm, receiving guests with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been planning this moment for a long time. He wore his confidence the way he always had. A little too loudly, a little too carefully, like something he had to remember to put on each morning. He had thought about whether Veronica would actually come. He had assumed she would. He had wanted her to. He had pictured it, the way she would walk in, take in the room, understand what he had built without her. and feel, for the first time, the full weight of what she had lost by not being what he needed. He had told Priya about it last week. He hadn't meant to, but it had come out over dinner, the way things did when he'd had a second glass of wine. He had said something about how it would be good for Veronica to see how far the firm had come. Priya had smiled and said, "Of course it will, darling," and changed the subject. She was good at that. What Donovan did not know was that, at the moment he was straightening his cufflinks and scanning the arriving guests, Charles Whitfield was standing in a conference room 3 floors below the party space, signing paperwork. The paperwork transferred Hargrove Industries' primary restructuring contract from Reed Consulting Group to Shaw Strategy Group. It also included, in the attached MOU, a provision for Franklin Cross's holding company to take a minority equity stake in Hargrove's restructured manufacturing arm. The legal team had worked through the previous night. Veronica had not slept. She arrived at the Meridian Tower at 8:15. She had worn charcoal, a suit so precisely cut it looked architectural, and she had not worn anything that could be described as trying too hard. She had pulled her hair back simply. She wore one piece of jewelry, a thin gold bracelet that had belonged to her mother. She did not go through the lobby entrance where Donovan was standing. She took the elevator from the 3rd floor, where she had just finished watching Charles Whitfield sign his name. The room shifted the way rooms shift when the actual thing that was supposed to happen starts happening. Veronica walked in from the side entrance near the bar, and she was not alone. Franklin Cross walked beside her. Not as an escort, not as an ornament, but as a partner, which was exactly what he was. Charles Whitfield followed them, still straightening his jacket, looking like a man who had just done something he had been meaning to do for a long time. The people who knew Charles Whitfield noticed him first. The financial press people in the room noticed Franklin Cross about 2 seconds later, and then the ripple moved through the crowd in that particular way. That means someone has appeared who was not in the program. Priya saw Veronica before Donovan did. She had seen photographs. She knew who Veronica was in the abstract, the way you know the outline of a story you've been told. What she had not expected was the specific quality of stillness that Veronica carried, the way she moved through the room as if she had reserved her table weeks ago. Priya said quietly, "Donovan." He was in the middle of a sentence with someone from the city council. He turned, tracking her gaze, and found Veronica. He found Veronica standing with Charles Whitfield. Something in his face did the calculation before his brain caught up. His expression didn't change. He was too practiced for that. But his eyes did something that Priya noticed and would not forget. A brief internal movement, a door closing. He excused himself and crossed the room. "Veronica." He said her name like it was a test. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. I wouldn't have missed it," she said. He glanced at Franklin, made the introduction in his head before making it out loud. Franklin Cross. He knew who Franklin Cross was. Everyone in that room knew who Franklin Cross was. "You know Charles," Veronica said, not as a question. Donovan looked at Charles Whitfield. Charles looked back at him with the expression of a man who is not going to make this easier for anyone. "Of course," Donovan said. "Charles, I didn't realize you were planning to attend tonight." "Last-minute decision," Charles said pleasantly. "I ran into Veronica downstairs. We had some paperwork to finish up." "Paperwork," Donovan repeated. "The restructuring transfer." Charles kept his voice collegial, the way people do when they want you to understand that the outcome is final and the conversation is optional. "We've moved Hargrove's engagement over to Shaw Strategy. I'm sure your team will be in touch about the transition." The jazz quartet was playing something soft in the corner. The orchids were perfect. The champagne was cold. Donovan stood in the middle of his own party and heard the sentence that meant the anchor deal of his launch. The one he had built the entire evening around. The press materials, the rebrand, the $140 million headline, had just walked out from under him. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I see." Priya found her way to the bar sometime after 10, and she stood there for a while without ordering anything, watching the room. She was not a foolish woman. She had understood in the weeks following her marriage to Donovan that there was a particular way he looked at his own history, selectively, like editing footage, keeping the shots where he was winning and cutting everything else. She had known, somewhere beneath the place where she kept the things she didn't examine, that there were versions of the story she hadn't been told. She thought about the way he had spoken about Veronica. The casual contempt. The certainty that a woman he'd fired would show up to his party still wounded, still diminished, still living inside the story he had written for her. She thought about the junior associate she had been, taking notes in someone else's meetings. She ordered a sparkling water and set it down without drinking it. Later, after the formal dinner had concluded and the guests were beginning to move toward the exits, Veronica stood near the window at the far end of the room. The city was still bright below. She had a glass of water in her hand. She had drunk champagne for exactly one toast. Charles Whitfield had made a brief remark to a small cluster of colleagues about exciting new directions, and she had lifted her glass with everyone else and felt something uncomplicated and clean move through her. Franklin came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. That was one of his qualities she had come to appreciate. He knew when silence was the right thing. "How do you feel?" he asked eventually. She thought about it honestly. "Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time," she said, "and I just set it down. And now? Now I want to get to work." She turned from the window. "The Hargrove transition is going to take everything we have for the next 6 months. I know, I want Olivia leading the integration team, and we should bring in someone with manufacturing background." Veronica. He said her name with the particular tone he used when she was doing the thing where she moved straight past the moment into the next task. She stopped. He looked at her steadily. "Let it land first." She looked at him. Then she looked back at the room, at the orchids Donovan had ordered, at the jazz quartet, at the space carefully assembled to stage a victory that had just quietly rerouted itself. She allowed herself for a moment to simply feel it. 3 years. A studio apartment and cold cereal and spreadsheets that didn't add up, and the specific grief of losing something you built with your own hands and watching someone else claim it. The version of herself who had opened that envelope and felt the deliberate cruelty of "come see what you missed out on." She had deserved better than that. She had always deserved better than that, and she had built it anyway. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Donovan Reed left his own party before the formal end of the evening. Priya stayed for another hour, speaking with people, being gracious in the way she had always been good at, and then she went home to an apartment that felt different than it had that morning. The press coverage the next day was complicated. The Hargrove story had leaked by midnight. Someone in Charles Whitfield's circle, or someone in the financial press who had been watching the room and making calls, and by morning there were 3 separate pieces running about the restructuring transfer. 2 of them mentioned Franklin Cross. All 3 of them mentioned Veronica Shaw. One of them, a business column that covered consulting industry moves, ran a photograph. It was taken at the party, somewhere around 9 o'clock. Veronica was standing near the window. She was not looking at the camera. She was turned slightly, talking to Franklin, and her expression was the particular kind of focused and settled that is very hard to manufacture. The caption read, "Shaw Strategy Group's founder at the Meridian Tower event." It said nothing about Donovan Reed. It didn't need to. Months later, when the Hargrove restructuring was deep into its second phase, and the manufacturing arm had stopped bleeding and started showing the first signs of something that might eventually look like health, Veronica sat in her office on the 31st floor and thought about what Franklin had said to her the night of the party. Let it land first. She thought about the kind of person who sends an invitation designed to wound. The particular insecurity underneath that impulse. The need to prove something, to have a witness, to convert another person's presence into evidence that you matter. She had known Donovan for 9 years, and she understood that he was not a villain in the way stories required villains. He was something more ordinary and more sad, a man who had never learned the difference between winning and taking. She hoped, in a way she had no investment in, that Priya would figure that out before too long. She turned back to her screen. There was a call in 20 minutes with the Hargrove board. There were 3 other clients waiting. There was work to do, real work, the kind that asked everything of her and gave back exactly as much. She had always been good at this. She had always known what she was worth. It had just taken a little while for the rest of the room to catch up.